Hi there, my name's Ruth Morgan. It's wonderful to be able to share some of my research with you, and I'd like to thank Liz Connor for the opportunity to participate in this coal-fired colonialism symposium. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples on whose lands I am presenting today around Canberra, and I'd like to acknowledge that their sovereignty has not been ceded and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who may be watching today, and to also pay my respect to their elders, past and present. Get my slides working. Many great claims were made for the Tasmanian blue gum that encouraged its prolific spread from the mid-19th century. Fabled for both its remarkable growth as well as medicinal properties, this eucalypt could quickly restore forests, improve climates, clean miasmatic airs, draw out water from diseased swampy areas, and ameliorate the threat of malaria and other fevers. As one Californian booster mused, the blue gum was a jack-of-all-trades tree. Such reports suggest, however, that animating environmental anxieties across European and North American empires were not desiccation and disease alone. In addition to these concerns, the appetite for fuel across the colonial world appeared insatiable, and the supplies of wood were feared to be diminishing, just as they were thought to have been in the Old World. Concerned commentators in California and South Asia cited the New World observations of Alexander von Humboldt to emphasize the implications of such a shortfall. By the felling of trees that cover the tops and the sides of the mountains, men in every climate prepare at once two calamities for future generations: the want of fuel and a scarcity of water. The devastating economic consequences of such a decline of fuel for colonial states, as well as the broader climatic and environmental implications for agricultural production, motivated efforts to establish forestry regimes that would regulate the uses of forests and encourage afforestation. That a particular tree might serve these ends better and more quickly than others was of no small consequence, with advocates extending from its native home in southeastern Australia to Kew, Paris and beyond. The blue gum flourished both on the page as well as in practice, allowing observers to measure the rhetoric against the reality. Ooh, here we are. As its record in California, southern India, Algeria and elsewhere suggests, of the many biotic exchanges of the long 19th century, the case of the blue gum is one that especially transcends bilateral, spatial or imperial framing. The blue gum instead invites more material and temporal perspectives to its spread. Since its reputation accrued over time in diverse colonial settings, its adoption was contingent on the extent to which local tree cover was feared to have been depleted, and its growth was hoped to secure the futures of colonial states. Focusing on contemporary understandings of the biological characteristics of the blue gum in southeastern Australia and South Asia from the mid-19th century, and the circulation of this knowledge between these sites, this paper draws on the insights of neo-materialism to argue that this tree's value and importance lay in its perceived ability to empower colonial states reliant on fuel wood for their energy needs, where an alternative, such as coal, was scarce. Historians such as David Arnold have only recently recognised the role of the blue gum in the energy regimes of southern India as a topic worthy of closer investigation. In the terms developed by the economic historian Prasannan Parthasarathi, rising energy demands produced a new energy economy of bio-steam power. With coal scarce and expensive in these regions, the bio-steam regime relied on the extraction of energy from wood. Although Parthasarathi focuses on the colonial deforestation of the Madras Plains, his approach guides this paper's attention to the material components of colonial power. Following the prevailing wisdom of plant geography, advocates hoped that the blue gum would provide bio-steam power in southern India during the 19th century. By highlighting the future-oriented aspirations for the blue gum, with its own independent impulses of growth and reproduction, this paper argues for the recognition of the temporal dimensions of species transfers. Beyond just the periodization of the global eucalypt, a temporal perspective embraces both the material or biological nature of the blue gum, as well as the political ambitions that its proponents hoped these material characteristics might serve. By their very nature, species transfers proceeded according to both the biochronologies of the plants in transit, that is their growth rates, and the human expectations for them. In the case of the blue gum in South Asia, these potentially different temporalities aligned. As Ulrike Kirschberger argues, colonial scientists appreciated the fast growth of introduced Australian trees because it seemed to synchronize human expectations with the rhythms of nature. This paper now turns not to the blue gum's native home in southeastern Australia, but instead to its planting in southern India in the Nilgiri Hills from the mid-19th century. Okay. From the early 19th century, British officials began to campaign for the recognition of the Nilgiri Plateau in southern India as an ideal location for the establishment of what they called a resort for invalids. Forming part of the Western Ghats, the steep Nilgiri Hills rise to a plateau some 7,000 feet above sea level, with grassy undulating hills and pockets of woodland known as sholas. Among the sites attracting European interest was Uti. It was becoming established as the major station in these hills. Uti's rise reflected the development of hill stations across British India at this time, where the prevailing medical geography was advising in favour of elevated climbs for the health of Europeans. These sanitary ideas pervaded contemporary accounts of the Nilgiris. Chaplain James Hough, for instance, observed in 1829 that the increased purity, coolness and elasticity of the air, the extensive prospect of tableland, covered with a beautiful verdure, adorned with cottages, woods and the windings of a majestic lake, and bounded by the horizon, with here and there a distant peak to break its uniformity, altogether produce a sensation not to be described and to be conserved only by those who have been favoured with such a transition from India's scorching plain. Here we have an early painting of the Uti's pastoral, I suppose. And these characteristics combined with the district's growing horticultural reputation to attract a significant European planting community to the hills, where they established plantations of cash crops, including cinchona, tea, and coffee. They later appealed to the newly appointed governor of Madras, Sir William Denison, who campaigned for Uti to become the presidency's summer capital during his term. By the time of Denison's appointment in the early 1860s, firewood in the hills had become dear, bad and scarce. During the 1850s, the construction of the Wellington Barracks and the Uttakamund Lawrence Asylum had increased local demand for firewood. In the ensuing decade, the extension of the Madras Railway improved the facilities for Anglo-Europeans to visit the hills, where they could partake in the Uttakamund hunt and enjoy newly constructed public buildings. In his 1861 collection of reports on forest activities in the Madras presidency, Conservator of Forests Hugh Cleghorn observed that the demands of this growing European presence, in the Nilgiri Hills were taking a toll on the local forests, the sholas. Although his report emphasised the impact of railways across Madras, of the Nilgiris he cautioned the increasing wants of the hill stations, the requirements of the Wellington Barracks and the assignments to settlers have drawn attention to the necessity of the remaining woods on the Nilgiri Hills. The Wellington Barracks alone consumed about 5,000 pounds of fuel daily in 1859, and he estimated that the local forests were providing fuel for 4,000 hearths each day. He also expected that the cooler conditions of these elevated climes would increase fuel demand for the purposes of cooking and heating. Now, the subject of deforestation in British India had concerned Cleghorn for over a decade. The preservation of forests such as sholas were not only important for their aesthetic appeal, but also for protecting local water supplies and ensuring sufficient supplies of timber and fuel wood. Although he was concerned about the increasing demand for fuel, he pointed the finger of blame for the condition of the forests at the practices of who he called the hill tribes. Despite colonial claims of the area and its peoples having no history, local tribal groups such as the Badagas and the Todas, pictured here, attracted the close attentions of European missionaries and anthropologists well into the 20th century. The former, the Badagas, practiced a form of shifting cultivation, Bertie, to raise crops that had long troubled Cleghorn's utilitarian sensibilities. In an 1851 report to the British Association for the Advancement of Science, he and his co-authors, for instance, had condemned a very similar practice of kumri as responsible for the destruction of India's forests, exhausting the soil, endangering plantations, and diminishing revenue. Further still, they argued, it was this form of cultivation that was morally harmful to its practitioners. In the Nilgiri Hills, similar findings were made. Bertie was inimical to agricultural progress and had to be curtailed. Their questionable agricultural practices aside, the hill tribes were nonetheless becoming a valuable source of cheap labour for the growing European establishment. Throughout his 1861 report, The Forests and Gardens of South India here, Cleghorn noted the role of the Badagas in the emerging fuel economy, taking on contracts to supply the Wellington barracks with fuel wood and planting out acacias. Now, although Cleghorn found British forestry wanting on the question of making provisions for firewood, he advised that the best kinds of wood to rear for fuel are the quickest growers in the country. Elsewhere in India, he said indigenous trees would answer better than exotics, but in the Nilgiri Hills at least, he wrote that the native hill trees are much slower in growth than the naturalised Australians. Cleghorn advocated for the closer oversight of the forests, which would improve revenue collection and incentivise private planting efforts. In addition to planting fast-growing Australian trees, Cleghorn also advocated a more conservative approach to the use of fuelwood and the substitution of peat for wood in kitchens. And the following year, the Governor, Denison, ordered the establishment of a government blue gum plantation. By the time Cleghorn compiled his 1861 Forests and Gardens of Southern India, Australian trees had been grown in the Nilgiris for nearly 2 decades. Among these exotic species, several in particular attracted the attention of European residents: the Acacia melanoxylon, blackwood, Acacia dealbata, silver wattle, and Eucalyptus globulus, the blue gum. Now, the provenance of these early ornamental plantings in the gardens of European residents isn't really clear, but by the mid-1850s, seeds had been reportedly obtained from Australia, as well as the government gardens, pictured here, and perhaps even the Cape Colony. The superintendent of the gardens had already noted that Australian plants of all kinds thrive particularly well here, which is a mark of the similitude of this climate and soil to that of Australia. He reserved special praise for the blue gum, with its apparent durability, being clean in its grain and resistant to pests. According to Cleghorn, plantations of Australian trees had commenced in 1856 with the planting of over 14,000 seedlings of Acacia robusta, and subsequent plantings also included eucalyptus. To sustain these plantations, he recommended, that a steady supply of seeds should be sought from Australia. In Australia, the Nilgiris found an enthusiastic partner, Ferdinand von Mueller, the Victorian government botanist and director of the Botanical Gardens in Melbourne. Von Mueller was already establishing himself as a champion of the eucalyptus, particularly the blue gum. Having introduced Prosper Rommel, a French businessman who visited the Victorian colony in 1854 to the blue gum's properties, this pair of gentlemen proselytised its virtues through their extensive networks across outposts of the British, French, and North American empires. The Madras Botanic Gardens had already established a relationship with von Mueller, exchanging seeds, plants, and techniques since at least 1859. The botanist was also known to Governor Denison, who, as Governor of New South Wales, had corresponded with members of Gregory's North Australia exploring expedition, among whose number included von Mueller. The pair had also subsequently corresponded about Australian timbers, including Eucalyptus globulus, as you can see here, soon after Denison's appointment as Governor of Madras. Denison himself was likely already predisposed to the qualities of the blue gum prior to his correspondence with Mueller, having promoted the tree in his term as president of the Royal Society of Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania, while serving as that colony's lieutenant governor. Von Mueller, for his part, recognised the potential economic benefit of the commercial export of seeds through his extensive botanical networks. As he reported in 1861 to the colonial Victorian government, one of our objects is to secure large quantities of seeds of some of our rapidly growing trees for introduction into timberless countries stretching through climatic zones similar to ours. He had that year dispatched seeds to Algeria, Port Natal, the United States, and the Fiji Islands, as he called them, and expected to send seeds to Hong Kong and Jerusalem. These trees not only grew quickly, von Mueller argued, but the small size of the seeds also allowed for their simple and straightforward transportation. According to his calculations, these most minute seeds could raise over 160,000 plants from just 1 pound of blue gum seeds. The early plantings of Australian trees were initially confined to the gaps in the shoulders that their cutting had left. These plantings were mostly fast-growing Australian acacias that were found to make excellent firewood. The havoc caused by the todas buffaloes aside, local foresters were encouraged by their rapid growth, reporting that they would soon provide the hills with ample stocks of fuel, having made immense gain upon the slow growth of the indigenous trees. That's a quote. Despite their initial promise, the acacias soon lost their luster as the depredations of various species of local parasites took their toll. Doubts too were cast on their growth from coppice, from which they struggled to regrow or became simply unmanageable. Local forest officials expected that demand for firewood in the Nilgiris would surely grow, not only on the hills, but also on the plains below. As the collector of Coimbatore argued in 1866, which you can see here on the screen, the growth of the more valuable woods, such as teak, blackwood, vengay, and many others, is a slow process. I think that the subject of the growth of the valuable species of Australian trees on a large scale on the Nilgiris deserves more consideration than it has hitherto received. These trees grow with great rapidity on the hills. They are valuable for their timber. And as the Indian hardwoods become scarcer, which they are doing every day, the value of the Australian trees will increase and they will be able to stand the expense of carriage. The system of fine roads on the hills now being opened out will tend greatly to reduce the cost of carriage, which as a rule would be downhill. At present, the low country supplies the hills with timber, whereas they would, in the course of 15 or 16 years, be enabled to send supplies down the guts. Now, most of these most valuable woods of the collector's report, the chief construction material for the railways rapidly proliferating across British India, had already been felled in the Nilgiris. But they remained the benchmark for establishing the quality of hardwoods. The blue gum's timber was reportedly equal to teak, according to a local forester, who had travelled to Australia in 1872 and became himself a reliable source of eucalyptus seeds in the hills. Other advocates pointed to its qualities of solidity, hardness, and durability, as well as its resistance to insects and damp. Some of the areas that had been originally planted with blackwood were cut down and replanted with blue gum. Between 1869 and 1881, the land covered by these plantations grew sixfold, from nearly 200 acres to over 1,200. Now, the growing railway network across South Asia was developing a voracious appetite. Let's see, here we go. Between 1869 and 1882, the state took over the construction of railways, adding a further, another at least 2,000 miles to the network. Cleghorn had earlier calculated that just one single mile of rail required over 1,700 sleepers. Now, accounting for the lifespan of the sleepers and the length of the lines, he estimated that that would be at least 253,000 sleepers, or say 35,000 trees, that would be required annually to meet this demand in Madras alone. But he was silent, quite interestingly, on the matter of their demand for fuelwood. Since the mid-1860s, at least, the government of India had been alive to the implications of the paucity of local coal reserves for the fuel provisions of the Madras railways, which you can see is certainly a problem on this map. Consequently, the Madras railways would require, I quote, a permanent and cheap supply of wood on the spot. The Australian trees in the Nilgiris continued to, I suppose, astound observers, we could say, with their growth, quote, 9 times as rapid as anything we can grow on the plains, as one forest conservator reported. Cleghorn had left India by this time, and Dietrich Brandis had taken the helm of British Indian forestry. In September 1881, on the eve of the passing of the Madras Forest Act the following year, Brandis visited the presidency to survey the management of its forests. The hunger for fuelwood prompted the government to more closely regulate the subcontinent's forests and to encourage afforestation efforts. Although local foresters counselled against extending the fuelwood plantations, Brandis was bullish about the prospects for the railways and the demand for the produce of the Nilgiri fuelwood plantations. In a subsequent report, he argued for the importance of establishing the rate of growth of forests in order to calculate an area's annual production of timber and wood to prepare for this very purpose. Without accurate knowledge of these matters, he explained, foresters work in the dark. Brandis dispatched Mysore's Deputy Conservator of Forests, David Hutchins, to measure the plantations of Australian trees in the Nilgiris. Since the 18th century, plantations such as these had offered foresters the ideal conditions to calculate the mass or volume of wood that a forest could be expected to yield. Ooh, no. The minimal diversity of a plantation allowed the forester to sample the forest and generalize accordingly. According to Hutchins' calculations, the yield of these trees, quote, far exceeded the yield of the most productive natural forests of plantations in Europe. The great advantage of the blue gum, he said, was that it reproduced quickly from coppice. As a result, it could be cut when 10 years old and produce an annual yield of 12 tonnes an acre. This approach recognised the quick growth that characterises trees' first few years and their ease of processing into firewood at this stage. Once coppice, trees can be cut back to the ground or back to stumps on a regular cycle, which then sprout new growth that can be repeatedly harvested. Based on these findings, Brandis was confident that these plantations could furnish a large supply of fuel to the Madras Railway should the line ever extend as far as Ooty. In these assessments, here we are, Brandis was echoing Cleghorn, who had nearly a decade earlier noted that the engrossing nature of the duties of today interferes with that foreseeing provision for the future, which distinguishes the profession of a forester more perhaps than any other. For Cleghorn, the forester should, quote, provide for the wants of future generations by preserving existing forests or forming new plantations. What Brandis and Cleghorn were both advocating was the continental forestry practice of sustainable yield, developed from at least the 18th century by the likes of Hans Carl von Carlowitz, of which Paul Ward has written extensively. These practices advocated the importance of artificial techniques in forestry, which directed the forester to intervene in the forest's growth. In doing so, as Paul Ward argues, von Carlowitz located the expertise of the forester at the heart of resource management. Who should plan ahead and manage the forests in order to avoid the occurrence of shortages and disruption to industry? In Germany and the Netherlands, a practice had emerged in the early 14th century that responded directly to this problem. When the supply of wood could not keep pace with demand, faster growing species were planted instead. The planting of fast-growing Australian trees in the Nilgiris followed this European tradition to ensure an abundance of wood to fuel Britain's interests in South Asia. This utilitarian ethos towards forest management was also aligned with the imperial spirit of improvement. Both the tribal peoples and the local forests of the Nilgiris had been found wanting and demanded colonial intervention. Not a single Indigenous tree is found which can be used as timber, reported one observer. Of the Australian trees, Brandis had marvelled in 1875. Their rate of growth is wonderfully fast, much faster than that of the Indigenous trees. Another account explained that the growth of the shoalers was exceedingly slow, their reproduction not less than 150 years, so that the annual yield is considerably under half a tonne per acre per annum. The blue gum offered the, quote, arboreal energy of both fuel and vitality that the local forests supposedly lacked. The blue gum's rapid rate of growth also appealed to emerging understandings in English horticulture. An early cultivator of Australian trees in the Nilgiris later referred to the influence of the English botanist John Lindley on the establishment of timber plantations in the hills. In 1855, Lindley had countered the accepted wisdom about the relationship between a tree's rate of growth and the strength of its timber. In the second edition of his Theory and Practice of Horticulture, he had declared that fast-grown timber is tougher than slow-grown and superior for all purposes of utility. For the forester planning a fieldwood plantation in southern India, this advice meant that the tree should be fast-growing and possessing high calorific powers. The blue gum then was an ideal companion species for the afforestation efforts underway in the Nilgiris. That such plants had to be sought from elsewhere is suggestive of Gregory Cushman's notion of neo-ecological imperialism, in which nutrients and energy are extracted from distant ecosystems to sustain colonial systems that can't support themselves within their own ecological, or we might say geological, limits. Both Cleghorn and von Mueller were attuned to the toll of resource extraction on local supplies. In von Mueller's case, he deplored the enormous consumption of indigenous wood in areas where a lack of coal or peat meant that the fuel supply could not be augmented by other sources of energy for reasons of expense or distance, as we can see here on the map. Even where coal was available, von Mueller suggested that forest resources promised a more sustainable source of fuel because of its renewable nature. Ooh, pardon me. He wrote, "We cannot altogether discard the idea that so far as coals are concerned, we are working on a capital, however large it may be, without ever adding to it." Expectations that the blue gum might thrive in the Nilgiris were also fostered by the prevailing botanical understandings of the suitability of particular plants to certain climes. Drawing on Humboldt's geographical categorization of the distribution of plants, the Indian-born botanist and physician John Forbes Royal published his own account of the geography of plants, which suggested what groups of plants to expect and what we may hope to successfully cultivate. Following this logic, Forbes Royal had earlier recommended the introduction of cinchona to the Nilgiris, which was eventually planted successfully in the early 1860s. Von Mueller too appealed to this school of thought in his 1880 Calcutta edition of Select Extratropical Plants, which he had compiled for use in Upper India. These select plants were suitable not only for extratropical countries, he explained, but also for high mountain regions within the tropics, such as the Nilgiris. As Hutchins observed in his report on the growth and yield of the Nilgiri blue gum plantations, as you can see here, it must be borne in mind that in Australia, it is most markedly in the cold, damp climate of the southeastern mountains that the eucalypts attain that wonderful development and rapid growth which has caused the blue gum to be planted all over the civilized world, and especially in cool mountainous regions in low latitudes, such as California, South Africa, and southern India. The fast-growing blue gum was well suited then to meet the Nilgiris' needs, and their planting could continue apace under the system of forest reservation legislated by the Madras Forest Act of 1882. Despite concerns about the impact of the blue gums on the water table, Brandis recommended that the shola should be replaced by eucalyptus, where they were expected to thrive in the rich shola soils. By 1886, almost 1/3 of the land of the Nilgiris had been reserved for this purpose. But within a decade, the planting of blue gums in the Nilgiris had come to an end. In the 1880s, their larch-like forests had offered Anglo-Europeans a pleasing contrast with the almost universally rounded forms of the primeval forest of the indigenous sholas. The blue gums and other exotic species had since become an unwanted blight on the appearance of the hills with their gloomy foliage and dreary colouring. One resident observed, as you can see, the cry today is not that there is any want of firewood, for trees barely pay for the felling, but that the houses and the stations are too often buried in masses of tall Australian trees, which shut out light, air, and the view. Although Brandis had hoped that the extension of the railway could render the local fuelwood plantations very profitable, the anticipated growth in demand had just not materialised. The plantings of the blue gum had, however, achieved a more modest goal of providing cheap fuel. As the Madras District Gazetteers declared here in 1908, the successful cultivation of these foreign trees has thus solved one of the most difficult of the problems which beset the foundation of the hill stations on the Nilgiris. For his part, David Hutchins, now Conservator of Forests in South Africa, drew on his measurements undertaken in the Nilgiris to champion the blue gum as a rival to coal in a 1902 letter to the scientific journal Nature. You can see here that he writes towards the end that when our coal supply is exhausted, when all the races of the world have fought for the waterfalls and places of high tide, pardon the spelling mistake there will still remain that which Englishmen of all the civilized races of the world do most neglect, the forest. So whether in the Nilgiris or elsewhere like California or Algeria, boosters of the blue gum were enamored with its rapid growth, durability, and suitability for sustaining the power of colonial biosteam regimes. In contrast to the blue gum's more elusive sanitary properties, the reality did at least seem to match the rhetoric when cultivated in climes similar to those of its southeastern Australian home. Thanks to the eco-cultural networks of botanical exchange in the Australian blue gum, colonial administrators in southern India found a remedy to the deficient vegetation and peoples that appeared to set limits on the imperial ambitions for the region. Although the blue gum's contributions proved far more modest than its advocates had hoped, its famed celerity offered the ideal foil to the deficiencies that foresters identified in colonized lands and peoples. Both materially and culturally, the blue gum manifested the promise of environmental and social improvement and the progress that its proponents sought to enact. Thank you. Looking forward to discussing this with you all soon.